dare you hang this trash next to real art? Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing across the rented gallery floor over the aggressive click of her heels. I froze in place, a heavy-duty staple gun still tightly gripped in my hand, as my cousin reached out and violently ripped my son's sailboat watercolor painting off the display board. She crumpled the paper in her fist without a single thought. 6-year-old Leo looked up, his lips trembling, absolutely devastated by the destruction of the project he had spent 3 hours creating. To understand how we got to this moment, you have to understand the dynamic that had defined my entire life. I was always the family's quiet disappointment. While my relatives bragged about corporate promotions and luxury vacations, I drove a reliable but decidedly unglamorous used Toyota. I wore thrifted sweaters because I actually preferred them, and I spent my days teaching 6-year-olds how to mix primary colors and paint clumsy, beautiful landscapes for a living. It was not a life that impressed anyone at family dinners, but it was mine, and I loved it. Then there was Vanessa. My cousin was the undisputed golden child of our generation. She was the one who could do no wrong, the family's shining star. She paraded around as the brilliant chief executive officer of Vanguard, a high-end fashion studio located right on Michigan Avenue. Her life was a carefully curated feed of designer clothes, exclusive parties, and constant praise. In our family's eyes, she was the ultimate success story, and I was just the dull backdrop she needed to look even brighter by comparison. That dynamic was exactly why she felt perfectly comfortable showing up 40 minutes late to my children's charity art show, making the kind of disruptive grand entrance that demanded everyone's immediate attention. The gallery had been filled with the soft, happy chatter of proud parents and excited children, but the moment Vanessa walked in, the energy shifted entirely. She did not come to support me or the kids. She came to make a point. She marched straight up to my display, grabbed a plastic cup of cheap punch from the refreshment table, and pointed her sharp acrylic nail directly at my rented easel. She did not bother to lower her voice. In fact, she projected it, making sure every single syllable carried across the crowded room. She told me I was nothing but a starving artist failure, just like my dead mother. The sheer audacity of the insult was breathtaking. But this is exactly what psychological abuse looks like when it is normalized over decades. You see, Vanessa had been conditioned by years of relentless family favoritism to view her exploitation of my passive nature as a sort of divine right. In her twisted mind, she genuinely believed her public cruelty was just tough love. She thought she was doing me a favor by putting a failure in her place, reminding me of the natural hierarchy that our family had established long ago. She had been rewarded for this exact behavior since we were children, taught that her viciousness was actually a sign of her superiority. The terrible words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The room of 20 parents and kids fell dead silent, staring at the confrontation in absolute shock. The cheerful classical music playing from the small speaker suddenly felt absurdly out of place against the suffocating tension. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They were completely paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of what had just happened in what was supposed to be a safe, celebratory space for young artists. I did not look at the parents, and I did not look at Vanessa right away. I looked down. I looked down at Leo. He was standing completely frozen by the display table. He was trying so incredibly hard not to cry, his lower lip trapped nervously between his teeth. He was clutching a broken crayon so tightly in his small fist that his knuckles were stark white. Seeing that pain, that innocent confusion on my little boy's face, stripped away the very last ounce of tolerance I had left for this family. Vanessa did not even wait to see the full effect her cruel words had on my little boy before pivoting sharply on her heel. She turned directly to her husband, David, who had been lingering a few steps behind her. He stood there looking mildly uncomfortable, but he said absolutely nothing to defend us, making him ultimately complicit in his silence. Vanessa sighed with heavy, exaggerated exhaustion, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive silk blouse. She loudly complained to him that they never should have wasted their precious Saturday afternoon at this poverty charity case. She practically spat the words out, projecting her voice to ensure that every single parent in the room heard her complete disdain for the modest community centre we had rented for the children's exhibition. I stayed completely silent. I let her words wash over me without reacting. My expression remained absolutely neutral, a perfectly blank mask that I had spent my entire adult life learning how to wear. I had learned years ago, through countless ruined holidays, stolen achievements, and hijacked family dinners, that showing any actual emotion only fed Vanessa's massive ego. Tears, anger, or even a simple defense of my son would only confirm her twisted belief that she held ultimate power over me. If I argued, she would call me hysterical. If I cried, she would call me weak. So, I offered her absolutely nothing. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, while she continued to complain bitterly to her husband about the venue, I calmly reached into the front pocket of my faded denim jeans. I pulled out my cracked smartphone. The shattered glass of the screen was a stark contrast to the perfectly manicured, flawless reality my cousin relentlessly projected to the world. But behind that broken glass lay a truth she could not even begin to fathom. I swiped past my lock screen, ignoring a notification about my son's upcoming dentist appointment, and opened my messaging application. I scrolled down just slightly and opened my ongoing text thread with Mr. Sterling. He was the senior property manager who handled the day-to-day operations and tenant relations for the commercial real estate portfolio. My thumb hovered deliberately over the digital keyboard. Vanessa was still going, her voice rising in pitch as she loudly complained to David about how the cheap linoleum floor of the community centre was going to permanently scuff the soles of her brand new designer shoes. She went on and on about the indignity of being forced to stand in such a run-down, dirty space, completely oblivious to the digital execution I was quietly preparing just a few feet away. I looked down at my glowing phone screen and slowly, carefully typed out a very specific, undeniable command: revoke suite 400 rent waiver. I did not send it immediately. I kept my thumb hovering right over the send button. I let the quiet anticipation build inside my chest, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of decades of constant belittlement funnel down into that single, decisive, physical action. I listened to her whine about the cheap linoleum floor one last time, letting her arrogance echo in my ears. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, I pressed send. The message swooshed away, a tiny green bubble instantly sealing her financial fate. I slipped the cracked smartphone back into my pocket, keeping my movements entirely smooth and unhurried. I finally looked up from where I was kneeling next to my devastated son, lifting my gaze to meet Vanessa's furious, impatient eyes. I kept my voice incredibly soft, almost a whisper, forcing her to stop talking and strain to hear me over the thick, uncomfortable silence of the shopped room. I told her I was just asking the property manager if we should continue her free rent. Vanessa's face lost all of its colour in an absolute instant. The smug, triumphant sneer that had twisted her features just moments before vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. The heavy layers of designer makeup she wore suddenly looked like a porcelain mask resting over pale, bloodless skin. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. The loud, overbearing socialite who had just been screaming across a crowded room was entirely gone. When she finally managed to speak, her voice dropped to a frantic, barely audible whisper. "What did you say?" I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I repeated it, perfectly calm, my words falling into the dead silence of the gallery like heavy stones. "Your commercial lease at Vanguard. I just sent the order to the property manager. I revoked your 100% discount." For a split second, Vanessa tried to fall back on her familiar arrogance. She let out a sharp, breathless scoff, tossing her head as if the very idea was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. But the performance failed. Her voice cracked violently with rising panic. "You cannot do that. You do not control the estate. The lawyers handle the properties. The law firm manages everything on autopilot. That is what we were told. That is how it works. She was desperately clinging to the lie she had believed for years. Vanessa, like the rest of my extended family, had always assumed that grandmother Eleanor's massive portfolio was simply locked in some blind legal trust, churning out passive benefits to the heirs without any human oversight. They believed their luxurious lifestyles and rent-free business spaces were an unshakable birthright. They thought the lawyers just stamped the papers and paid the bills. They never once considered that someone was pulling the strings. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my position. I simply opened the email application on my phone. I scrolled past my daily painting supply receipts and opened a highly secured, encrypted folder. I pulled up the digitized master deed documents, along with the official, notarized letters of trust. Without a single word, I shoved the cracked screen directly into Vanessa's trembling hands. "Read it," I commanded. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers shake as she gripped the edges of my cheap, battered phone. I watched her eyes dart desperately across the glowing screen, frantically scanning the dense legal jargon for a loophole, a mistake, a sign that this was all just some elaborate, spiteful prank. But there was no mistake. She read the unredacted truth right there in black and white. She saw my full legal name listed not as a mere beneficiary, but as the sole heir and outright owner of the entire $62 million commercial real estate portfolio, heavily protected behind a blind trust illusion. Every single building, every single retail space, every single piece of prime property our family had inherited from grandmother Eleanor. I owned it all. I controlled it all. I watched the exact second the reality crushed her. The absolute horror dawning in her eyes as she realized that the quiet, supposedly worthless cousin she had just humiliated in front of 20 strangers was actually the sole architect of her high society existence. I stepped closer to her. I encroached on her personal space, forcing her to look up from the screen and meet my gaze. When I spoke this time, my voice was no longer just calm. It was edged with cold, unforgiving steel. Every single month for 4 years, I said, making sure she heard every syllable. Every single month for 4 years, I have personally reviewed the ledgers. And every single month, I have personally approved waiving your $85,000 monthly rent. I let that astronomical number hang in the air between us. $85,000 a month. Over $1 million a year. That was the true cost of her glamorous Vanguard fashion studio on Michigan Avenue. That was the reality of her fake success. I had silently subsidized her entire lavish lifestyle, absorbing the massive financial loss, because despite her endless cruelty, I had stupidly believed that family was supposed to support family. I had given her a blank check for 4 years, and she had repaid my quiet generosity by terrorizing my 6-year-old son over a watercolor painting. The silence in the community center gallery wasn't just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The air felt thick, charged with the electric shock of the truth I had just unleashed. I watched Vanessa's perfectly contoured face. The smug, untouchable mask she had worn for her entire adult life fractured. Then it shattered completely. She physically slumped. It wasn't a graceful, dramatic swoon. It was a total, pathetic collapse of her rigid, arrogant posture. Her knees simply gave out beneath her, unable to support the sudden, crushing weight of reality. She fell backward, landing heavily into one of the cheap folding chairs set up along the wall for the parents. The flimsy metal frames squeaked and groaned in loud protest under her sudden weight, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet room. As she dropped into the cheap folding chair, the prized anchor of her entire aesthetic, her immaculate, weight-listed, $4,000 Birkin bag slipped from her trembling shoulder. It hit the ground with a wet, heavy smack, landing directly in a spreading puddle of bright crimson acrylic paint that had been spilled earlier by a careless toddler. The expensive, imported leather instantly soaked up the cheap, toxic red pigment, staining it irreparably. Yesterday, Even a microscopic scratch on that bag would have sent Vanessa into a screaming, vindictive rage. Right now, she didn't even blink. She didn't look down. Her eyes remained locked on my face, wide, bloodshot, and utterly terrified. Looking at her sitting there, shaking and pale in that cheap folding chair, I experienced a profound moment of clarity. For years, I had believed Vanessa was inherently powerful. I had thought her cruelty came from a place of unshakable superiority, but I was wrong. I realized, watching her hyperventilate, the fundamental difference between having wealth and being a person of substance. Vanessa's entire high society identity, the designer clothes, the exclusive invites, the unbearable arrogance was nothing but a rented costume. And I was the one who had been secretly paying the rental fee. She had confused having access to money with being someone of actual value. Her social status was just a hollow shell, a position bought with someone else's quiet generosity. It was a complete illusion. The exact moment the money vanished, her core identity didn't just crack. It crumbled into absolute nothingness. Without my monthly subsidy, she wasn't a powerful CEO. She wasn't a tastemaker. She had no internal foundation, no genuine character, and no real skills to fall back on. She was just a cruel, empty woman sitting in a stained chair, stripped of the armor she hadn't even bought herself. When she finally managed to speak, the sharp, biting edge of her voice was entirely gone. It was replaced by a desperate, high-pitched stammer. Maya, please, she whimpered, her manicured hands gripping the cold metal edges of the chair. You can't do this. You can't just cut me off. Vanguard is my life. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, my hand resting gently on Leo's shoulder. David's business. She choked out a sob, looking frantically around the room, no longer caring who heard her. David's logistics firm is failing. We are drowning, Maya. We are absolutely drowning. We have hundreds of thousands in hidden credit card debt. We've been taking out predatory loans just to pay the interest on the other loans. If we lose the studio space, if we lose that income, we lose the house. We lose everything. We'll be completely ruined. She looked up at me, tears cutting thick tracks through her expensive foundation, expecting to find the soft, compliant cousin she had bullied for a lifetime. But the well of my empathy had run completely dry the moment she had insulted my 6-year-old son. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I know, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly across the dead silent room. Vanessa stopped crying. She froze. What? She whispered. What do you mean, you know? I crossed my arms, standing tall over her. As the outright owner of Grandmother Eleanor's estate, my legal team conducts comprehensive credit checks whenever commercial leases are up for renewal. Did you really think your predatory loans and hidden mountain of credit card debt could bypass a corporate background check? David, who had been standing paralyzed behind her, actually swayed on his feet. The whispering among the other parents suddenly grew louder, a wave of shock and judgment washing over the room. The full weight of their financial exposure, the ugly truth behind their wealthy facade, was now laid bare in front of a room full of the very people they desperately tried to impress. I had watched them live far beyond their means for years, subsidized by my silence. That silence was now officially over. Here is your choice, I commanded, my voice edged with unforgiving steel. You turn around and you leave Leo's art show immediately. Or I make one phone call to the police right now and have you escorted out for trespassing, and your 30-day eviction notice gets filed tomorrow morning. Vanessa let out a choked, panicked gasp. She scrambled to her feet, frantically snatching up her ruined $4,000 Birkin bag from the puddle of paint, smearing the thick crimson acrylic across her pristine silk blouse in the process. She grabbed David by his sleeve, yanking him forward like a frightened child. They aggressively pushed past the circle of staring, whispering parents. There was no grand exit. There was no final, biting insult. Her designer heels slipped awkwardly on the cheap linoleum floor, her arms flailing for balance, stripping away her last shred of manufactured dignity. I stood beside my son, my hand firmly on his shoulder, and watched them flee the community center in total, absolute humiliation. The heavy metal door clicked shut, permanently severing Vanessa and David from our world. The silence in the community center lasted only a fraction of a second before the collective, heavy exhale of the room finally broke it. Parents I barely knew were suddenly surrounding me, offering sympathetic smiles, kind words, and fresh art supplies. I ignored the commotion and knelt down on the scuffed linoleum, my focus entirely on Leo. He was clutching the two ripped halves of his watercolor sailboat. His little chest was heaving with leftover adrenaline, but the tears had stopped. "It's ruined, Mom," he whispered, his lip trembling. "No, it's not," I said gently, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. "Sometimes things get broken by people who don't know how to handle them, but that doesn't mean they can't be put back together." A kind mother kneeled beside us and handed me a roll of clear tape. Together, Leo and I carefully aligned the jagged, torn edges of the thick paper, using the clear tape to seamlessly mend the sailboat watercolor. The scar was visible, but the boat was whole again. It had survived the storm. A father stepped forward and clapped me respectfully on the shoulder. "You handled that outburst with such remarkable grace," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I would have lost my mind if someone spoke to my kid that way." I smiled politely, thanking him. They had no idea. They thought they had just witnessed a struggling single mother maintain her quiet dignity in the face of a wealthy, arrogant bully. They were completely unaware of the invisible, multi-million-dollar armor I was wearing. My grace wasn't born from passive endurance or victimhood. It was born from a place of absolute, unshakable power. Later that night, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving me in the quiet sanctuary of my modest two-bedroom apartment. The streetlights from the avenue cast long, familiar shadows across my second-hand couch. I brewed a cup of cheap chamomile tea, sat at my small kitchen table, and opened my phone. I pulled up my message thread with Mr. Sterling, the senior property manager for Grandmother Eleanor's trust. I didn't need to write a long, emotional paragraph to justify my decision. Justice doesn't require dramatic explanations. It only requires decisive action. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Proceed with Vanguard eviction in 30 days. No extensions. I hit send. Just like that, the final toxic thread binding me to the illusion of my extended family was severed. I wasn't just ending a commercial lease. I was ending a lifetime of being treated as a convenient stepping stone for people who despised me. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air blew off Lake Michigan, carrying with it a sense of absolute renewal. The Vanguard fashion studio was gone. The arrogant branding, the imported Italian marble, the racks of overpriced garments permanently closed, gutted, and wiped clean from the city's memory. Vanessa's empire of cruelty had vanished into thin air the exact moment it was no longer artificially propped up by my silent subsidies. I stood in the center of the newly renovated Suite 400 on Michigan Avenue. The massive 10,000 square foot commercial space was completely unrecognizable. We had torn down the isolating, frosted glass walls. We had ripped out the elitist champagne bar. In their place were wide, open workspaces flooded with natural light. Long wooden tables, covered in butcher paper, stretched across the room. Canvases, easels, clay, and endless jars of bright, non-toxic paint lined the walls. Suite 400 was no longer a monument to high society vanity. I had converted it into a free children's art academy, fully funded by the estate. This was the true meaning of justice. Revenge isn't just about tearing down the people who hurt you or dwelling on the pain of the past. True justice, the kind of justice that heals, is about taking the resources they misused and planting seeds for the future. I had turned Vanessa's monument to vanity into a vibrant, thriving ecosystem of creativity and hope. That was the ultimate victory, an act of creation that made their past cruelty feel small and insignificant. In the center of the sunlit room, bathed in the golden afternoon glow, stood Leo. He was wearing a massive apron that hung past his knees, holding a paintbrush almost as long as his arm. He was proudly painting a massive new canvas, completely lost in the joy of creation. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation, no worry that someone was going to walk up and tear his hard work in half. Watching him laugh as a smear of blue paint landed on his nose, I finally understood the truth. Family isn't defined by bloodlines, inheritance, or maintaining toxic social hierarchies. It is built entirely on fierce protection, genuine kindness, and unconditional love. I had walked away from the people who shared my DNA, and in doing so, I had finally found my peace. I watched my son dip his brush into a jar of bright yellow paint, leaving a bold, vibrant stroke across his blank canvas. Our new life had just begun, and it was going to be a masterpiece.